Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Skinner's Xbox, the podcast for video gamers who want to learn more. My name is Mara, a behavior analyst/gamer, and this week we'll be diving into the controversy around the schedules of reinforcement and their application to gambling in video games. Do their risks outweigh their practical uses? We'll have special guest Cecilia on with us in a moment to discuss further. But why is this important? In 2012, Rice and Kiyonka estimated that gambling costs totaled $37 billion, and that's not even including video gaming, where players can often spend real-life currency on loot boxes and other in-game items. 1 to 3% of those who identified as gamblers meet the criteria for problem gambling. Drummond and Sauer found that 65% of American households, at least one person plays video games. So, what did Skinner think about gambling? Did he see the benefits, or did he argue against it? Let's jump right in and get this conversation started. Hi, Cecilia, welcome.
Hey, Mara, thanks for having me. So, in Beyond Freedom and Dignity, Skinner argued against gambling as a form of leisure activity. He stated that gambling is the only leisure activity in which the reinforcer is not contingent on the quality of skill of the individual. Rather, consequences are contingent upon contrived schedules of reinforcement, which could lead to a gambling disorder. According to DSM-5, this disorder involves repeated problematic gambling behavior that causes significant problems or distress. And for some people, gambling becomes an addiction, potentially leading to problems with finances, relationships, work, and legal issues.
Okay, so let's start with some elementary students. Do they gamble? What are the implications for, let's say, video games?
Well, surprisingly, elementary students also have been found to gamble at excessive rates. Ledouceur and colleagues found that over 85% of the students in grades 4 to 6 admitted to gambling in the form of betting money, which included betting on sports, card games, and games of chance, such as flipping coins, rolling dice. And Drummond and Sauer explained how playing video games is a common leisure activity for young children and adolescents. Loot boxes, as you briefly mentioned, are commonly found in video games, which are the purchasable randomized rewards. There are concerns that these loot boxes may constitute as a form of unregulated gambling due to its close resemblance to real-world gambling. This type of reward structure utilizes a variable schedule of reinforcement, which results in the gamer being motivated to maintain gambling behavior in hopes of receiving a reward.
That's so interesting. So then how do children learn to gamble?
Well, there's a cool study by Johnson and Dixon in 2009 that exposed children to a simulated board game to determine if they could be trained to discriminate between relational frames of more than and less than.
Oh yeah, I heard about that study.
Yeah, they found that arbitrary relations, in other words, the dice colors, can exert stimulus control over gambling behavior. After conditional discrimination training, most children showed a preference for the color dice associated with the relational frame of more than.
But this isn't gambling, right? The children aren't actually losing their real money.
Actually, they suggested that risk-taking behavior may be strengthened for children because losing is not as aversive for them, since they're not losing real money like adults.
I think that study also talked about how choice-making behavior can be strengthened as well through, again, that relational framing.
You're right. So what are your thoughts about how choice affects gaming?
I think that choice is a really important factor in why video games may be considered a preferred activity for people. So Herrnstein's matching law states that the proportion of responses across concurrent choices are distributed in ways that match the rates of reinforcement for each. So Kangas and his colleagues applied matching law to a computerized rock, paper, scissors game. So what they found was that when accurate instructions were given on how the computer would respond, the participants were able to maximize their rate of reinforcement. So what this actually meant was they won more games by allocating their responses to either rock, paper, or scissors, depending on the rule. So this really enhanced their gameplay performance.
That's cool. But how does that relate to video games?
So take an example from a video game that I play, Overwatch. There are multiple game modes available, each with a different schedule of reinforcement. I can play arcade matches to gain loot boxes, or I can play the normal game mode where I gain experience. Matching law would suggest that I will play the game mode that most frequently results in access to reinforcement, so loot boxes, based on how well I'm playing. I think this is actually a really good segue into another conversation about schedules of reinforcement. So how would you describe their influence on maintaining gambling or gaming behaviors?
Well, as many of your listeners know, in variable ratio schedules, rates of responding remain very high even when the schedule has been thinned significantly.
Thanks, Cooper.
So, for example, in a video game, you could play 10 matches, and even though you're losing, you'd keep playing because there's a chance you'll win the next one. And as a result, this gaming behavior is extremely hard to extinguish.
Now, what about schedules of reinforcement in gambling?
Actually, even though slot machines are typically used as examples for VR schedules, Crossman found that all electronic gaming machines operate under a more complex random ratio schedule of reinforcement, in which the probability of reinforcement is determined using a random number generator.
Wait, could you quickly explain the difference between a VR and an RR schedule for our listeners?
Oh, yeah. So with VR schedules, the probability of a reinforcer for the next response increases with each unrewarded response. Whereas under an RR schedule, each response outcome is independent of the previous responses, since there's a constant probability of payoff for each trial. And thus, the distribution of reinforcement in an RR schedule is very different from a VR schedule. For instance, traditional slot machines and other gambling devices have a constant probability of payoff for each bet, which isn't true for the VR schedule. In other words, the total number of times that you lose won't increase your chances of winning the next game.
If I'm understanding correctly, a VR schedule will always be contingent on an individual's responses, but that would not be the case with an RR schedule. Is that what you mean about constant probability?
Exactly. And in an arcade or casino setting, when there are a number of machines having different RR distributions, this may affect machine persistence. And as a result, it's possible for players to demonstrate a preference for schedules based on the number of early wins and unreinforced trials, rather than the average frequency of wins.
Yeah, I can see how someone might be more persistent with gambling on an RR schedule, especially while that's in effect.
Yeah, and as a result, that could promote irrational or repetitious beliefs, as Skinner calls it, about winning, which ties back to how gambling is a maladaptive leisure activity. The RR schedule promotes the gambler's fallacy, which keeps the individual playing for long periods of time, even with little to no payoff. According to Bradshaw and colleagues, both variable and random ratio schedules generally support higher rates of responses and are the most resistant to extinction due to the individual not discriminating when they will receive reinforcement.
It seems like you're portraying gambling in a very negative light. To play devil's advocate, I think we should discuss more.
That's fair. Let's talk more about risk taking behavior. What do you think can be done to minimize the possible negative effects?
Silverberg and his colleagues evaluated participants' risky choice responses. In this case, two spinners were available with white and black segments. One, the safe wheel, had a 94% chance of winning a small money amount, where the second had a 38% chance of winning a larger dollar amount. To make the second spinner more risky, the percent chance of winning reduced the more times a participant would spin a win. So by manipulating the intertrial interval to either 25 seconds or 90 seconds, they found that the group with the longer intertrial intervals allocated their responses to the safe wheel option. So it seems as if they were more likely to demonstrate self-control behavior.
Hmm. Let's think about slot machines and other gambling activities. In many cases, the intertrial intervals are very brief, so I'd argue that the way in which these games are set up forces people into a reinforcement trap, as Bob suggests.
That's actually a really good point to consider. We just had a listener question come in. They were asking if you could explain near misses and how it relates to an individual's responding.
Ooh, great question. Near misses is another reason why gambling is a maladaptive behavior. It's when an individual comes very close to winning but doesn't, and is another factor that influences gambling. Rice and Kiyonka found that near misses actually function as conditioned reinforcers and are fundamentally similar to wins, which encourages gambling behavior. Meanwhile, Dixon and colleagues in 2009 explored the degree to which recreational gamblers rated closest to win ratings of various slot machine outcomes following the pairing of stimulus equivalence classes. And similar to Johnson and Dixon's research with children, they also suggested that the near miss effect is a derived verbal relation.
So, if the near miss effect is, as you say, a derived verbal relation, does that mean that it can be altered using either relational training or conditional discrimination procedures?
Yep, exactly. Their results support that the near miss effect is a verbal relation that can be altered rather easily using those types of trainings.
So, I've also looked into the Dixon research that you just spoke about, and from what I remember, during their pretest conditions, subjects rated near misses as stimuli closer to winning, where following training, the near miss stimuli were rated closer to losing, suggesting that, gambling might not be as bad as you say. Unfortunately, it looks like we're running out of time. So, is there anything else that you think we should talk about? Maybe other behavioral concepts that might relate to gambling or gaming behaviors?
That sounds good. I think we should also talk about how rule governed behavior plays a factor in maintaining gambling.
Perfect. That sounds great.
So, in 2014, Dixon and colleagues found that pathological gamblers were less sensitive to rule changes and actually take longer to adapt to new rules. This explains the common rules that players engage in as self instructions. If you recall, we previously mentioned gambler's fallacy, where a gambler believes that a series of losses predict an upcoming reversal of outcomes. So, in other words, winning. There's also the hot hand fallacy, in which a gambler believes a series of wins serves as an SD for additional wins. This highlights the disadvantage of rule governed behavior, where pathological gamblers would be more likely to stick to their self instructions rather than to actual changing contingencies. All right, we've talked about children and video games, adults and pathological gambling, but is there any research that looks at the elderly and recreational gambling?
I'm really glad you brought that up. So, in 2010, Dixon and colleagues explored the effects of a simulated gambling activity on nursing home residents. So, don't worry, they operationally defined happiness for all you behavior analysts listening. So, each of the three participants engaged in higher percentages of intervals with happiness measures after the simulated gambling activity, regardless of the duration they played. So benefits were observed even after 5 minutes of playtime, and the additional benefit was the simulated aspect of the game meant that no real money had to be wagered.
It would be interesting to see if this can be replicated while measuring generalization and maintenance effects.
Oh no, it looks like we are out of time now. I'd love to have you back though next week where we can spend some more time discussing these concepts and also get some additional listener feedback and questions as well.
Yeah, I had a great time chatting with you, Mara, and I hope your listeners start to understand the negative aspects of gaming and gambling, starting with how loot boxes influence children when they're young, and especially with how VR and RR schedules of reinforcements trap a person into responding. And lastly, with how rule governed behavior can promote insensitivity to changing contingencies.
But don't forget about the benefits of gaming and gambling. So, in game performance can be increased when accurate rules or instructions are provided and access to reinforcement might be maximized. And in how you say maladaptive gambling behaviors may be reduced through relational frames and conditional discrimination training. And finally, how it may be a great activity to engage in as you age. Thank you again to Cecilia for joining us this week. I think this will turn into a really interesting podcast series. And again, thank you as always to our listeners. If you want to show us your appreciation, subscribe, leave a review, and share the show with your friends. Below, we'll leave our reference list for the articles that we've talked about and some more links for you to follow. Logging out for this week. Good game, everyone.